Hello, everyone. Let's move into chapter 6, and this is leading people. It's one of the richest chapters in the book, so we're going to enjoy this one, I think.
So, the gender and leadership wars. We're going to open by talking about preferences for male versus female leaders, a topic that gets especially heated in societies where corporate leadership carries a lot of cultural weight.
That's right. And this is actually the area that I researched for my PhD and my dissertation. So, preferences for male versus female leaders is a topic that's very close to my heart. It's true in individualistic cultures. Why do you think it is? Well, perhaps because success tends to get attributed heavily to a leader personally rather than the group or the circumstances. And we have to address leadership stereotypes here directly, as we spoke early on when we first started with chapter 1 and 2. When we tend to think male, we tend to think leader. And we have to look honestly at those attitudes towards female leaders. We talked about the fact that the United States has never had a female president, and we asked, why do you think that is? We also did the exercise, right? And at the beginning of the course, in our first lecture, where we asked you to say, what are some things women do well? What are some things they don't? What are some things men do well? What are some things they don't? And you may go back to that list and take a peek at it and think about your own attitudes towards women and men and how that translates into their leadership. Because those attitudes about men and women and what they're good at, they translate directly into leadership. Our attitudes, they basically are why we would think about leadership in a certain way and how it's related so intimately to gender and what those attitudes, what we can do about those attitudes to start reshaping them.
And so, here with this list, we have leader competencies. So, here's a striking finding to sit with. Women can outscore male leaders across several different competency categories, and yet they're still not making proportional gains in actually obtaining leadership positions.
So take a look at this chart a little bit. We'll give you a minute to do that, but you can also do it on your own time when you peek at these slides and take a look at them. This is one that's not in your textbook. It's one I found separately, but there are some different charts in your textbook as well. Again, leader preferences. Why the disconnect if women are consistently outranked in several different dimensions? Even though US adults often say gender isn't a significant factor in who they prefer as a leader, when people express a preference, men still tend to be preferred, despite the fact that women consistently score higher on leadership dimensions and competencies. As I told you, I researched this in my own dissertation research. I did focus groups of male and female participants, and my own research back in 2008 and 9 found consistent with the research that we see today, that there was across the board a preference for male leaders over females, whether it was male dominated, female dominated professions, regardless of the context, regardless of the scenario that I played out, even regardless of the leadership style, whether it was transactional, transformational, there was still a male leaning preference.
And so, even further, and to add some possible explanations, such as persistent stereotypes that masculine characteristics are simply seen as more effective for leadership, ongoing prejudice against female leaders, and which may help explain why the US had such a hard time electing a woman president on two different accounts, and real differences in typical male versus female leadership behavior and how those behaviors get received.
Exactly. So let's talk about some of these leadership stereotypes and effects. This is where role congruity theory from Alice Eagly was mentioned earlier. And building on her earlier social role theory, again, this talks about how women experience a perceived incongruity between leader roles and gender roles. As we said, women just aren't seen as fitting in the role. Again, people tend to think leader, think male. Uh, and that incongruity diverts women from pursuing managerial careers in many cases, and it creates both real and both tangible and intangible barriers in the selection process and constricts how far female managers can actually advance.
What you had said with Virginia Sheen's research in the 1970s, where both male and female middle managers at the time believed successful managers had more male matched personal characteristics. And that's the think manager, think male mindset.
Absolutely. So more recently, women are less inclined to see management as inherently male, as an inherently male career path, but the mindset shifted more towards think manager, think masculine, rather than completely disappearing.
Well, and then that reminds me of the longitude study, which is the Butterfield and Powell analysis, which tracked the part-time MBA students across 3 decades, starting in the 1970s, using the BEM sex role inventory, the BSRI. And so the hypothesis to this study was that as more women entered management, perceptions of a good manager might become more androgynous, high on both masculine and feminine traits.
Yes, but unfortunately, the results didn't quite support that. A good manager was still seen by most respondents as possessing predominantly masculine characteristics. So think manager, think masculine held up even as the proportion of women in management increased.
And so, when we examine attitudes towards women as leaders, female leaders tend to get devalued relative to male leaders under three specific conditions: when they use stereotypically masculine leadership style, when they occupy a traditionally male intensive leadership role, or when they're being evaluated specifically by men.
It's worth noting a couple of things. So subordinates overall report similar satisfaction with male and female managers. And having more positive direct experience with a female manager tends to produce more positive attitudes going forward. So attitudes have shifted a lot historically too, and such as in 1965, 41% of male executives viewed women in management unfavorably. However, by 2005, 88% viewed them favorably.
So, transformational versus transactional. Let's talk about the leadership style theories. There's task style versus interpersonal style, and democratic versus autocratic decision making. Transformational leaders motivate people to set high standards for the good of the group and essentially turn followers into leaders themselves through charisma, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized attention.
That's right, and transactional leaders operate differently. They clarify responsibilities and respond based on how well people execute them. Using contingent reward and monitoring for mistakes. They're kind of your micromanagers, but there's also laissez-faire leadership, which is distinct from both of these and tends to be the least preferred option with unless you have very highly skilled and highly competent leaders that you can trust to perform their leadership. But it's essentially avoiding responsibility, giving little direction and staying uninvolved. But this, again, this will work well if you have followers that do not need direct supervision of any kind.
Well, so then there's the two other frameworks which matter here. Situational leadership theory from Hershey and Blanchard, which says that leaders should shift their interpersonal style as subordinates mature, moving from high task, low relationship to high task, high relationship, and as well to low task, high relationship to low task to relationship.
Tannenbaum and Schmidt's theory argues that leaders should become more democratic and less autocratic, as subordinates need more independence. And here's where gender stereotypes map onto all of this. Autocratic leadership gets coded as the masculine stereotype, dominance and control. And democratic decision making gets coded as feminine stereotypical behavior, involvement of others. So Tannenbaum and Schmidt's model essentially argues effective leadership trends towards an increasingly feminine style over time.
So, what does actual evidence show?
I
In
don't-
terms of sex differences, women rate higher on democratic leadership, on the transformational leadership dimensions, and on contingent reward, which is actually a transactional behavior, which all three are positively associated with leadership effectiveness.
That's right. And men rate higher on active and passive management by exception and on laissez-faire leadership, which are both negatively associated with effectiveness. So, going purely by what the research says predicts good leadership outcomes, the female associated behaviors come out ahead.
And in terms of promoting effective leadership, this right here within the chart shows us and gives us a set of recommendation and recommended actions, which confront prejudices against leaders based on sex, evaluate leaders on real criteria like task accomplishment and developing subordinates, publicize the actual qualifications of people in leadership roles, and develop leadership capability in everyone, not just an assumed few.
So create conditions that give leaders of both sexes an equal shot at success. Actively confront any belief that you personally don't have what it takes. And if you happen to be the first woman in a particular leadership role, like a token, recognize that you can lean into being seen as a symbol of change rather than trying to minimize it.